Most notorious African military juntas.
Audio Jungle.
Number 10. Jean-Bedel Bokassa of the Central African Republic. Jean-Bedel Bokassa reigned as the ruler of the Central African Republic from 1966 to 1979, remains a dark chapter in the nation's history. Bokassa's ascent to power and subsequent actions earned him the reputation of a tyrannic military dictator. He was born on February 22, 1921 in Bobangui, a small village in what was then French Equatorial Africa and is now the Central African Republic. He began his military career in the French colonial army during World War II and subsequently served in various French colonial units, rising through the ranks. His early experiences in the military provided him with the skills and connections that would prove instrumental in his later political ambitions. Bokassa's path to power began in 1966 when he led a military coup against President David Dacko. At the time, the Central African Republic was a fragile and newly independent nation grappling with political instability and economic challenges. Bokassa's coup marked the start of his ruthless dictatorship. Once in power, Bokassa swiftly moved to consolidate his authority and establish an authoritarian regime. Bokassa was quick to silence any opposition in his rule. He dissolved the National Assembly, suspended the constitution, and outlawed political parties, effectively eliminating any checks and balances on his power. His regime employed violence and intimidation to suppress dissent. Bokassa fostered a cult of personality, presenting himself as the emperor of the Central Republic Empire after proclaiming the nation a monarchy in 1976. He adopted lavish symbols of royalty and extravagance, including coronation ceremonies and extravagant ceremonies that drained the nation's resources. Bokassa's regime was marked by widespread human rights abuses. Reports of torture, extrajudicial killings, and forced labor were common. The brutal tactics employed by his security forces instilled fear among the population. Bokassa mismanaged the country's resources, leading to economic decline and hardship for the people. Despite its rich natural resources, the Central African Republic remained one of the poorest nations in the world during his rule. Bokassa's actions on the domestic front also had severe repercussions on the international stage. His extravagant coronation as emperor in 1977, which cost a staggering amount of money, drew widespread condemnation and led to a rupture in diplomatic relations with many countries. The international community increasingly isolated his regime due to its human rights abuses and economic mismanagement. Bokassa's tyrannical rule came to an end in 1979 when he was ousted from power by French military intervention. He went into exile but returned to Central African Republic years later, where he faced trial for crimes against humanity. He was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death, although his sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment. Number 9. Mengistu Haile Mariam of Ethiopia. Mengistu Haile Mariam's tenure as the leader of Ethiopia from 1974 to 1991 was marked by a level of brutality and oppression that has earned him a place among the world's worst dictators. His path to power began with the overthrow of Emperor Haile Selassie in a military coup in 1974. This marked the end of centuries of monarchy in Ethiopia and the emergence of a Marxist regime. Mengistu quickly rose through the ranks of the ruling Dirge, a community of military officers, and eventually assumed control of the country. His ascent to power was characterized by ruthless purges of political rivals and opponents, foreshadowing the brutality that would define his rule. Mengistu's rule was characterized by a reign of terror that affected every facet of Ethiopian society. His regime conducted mass execution of perceived enemies, both real and imagined. Thousands of Ethiopians were summarily executed, often in public, as a means of instilling fear and suppressing dissent. These executions were carried out with chilling regularity, earning the regime the moniker Red Terror. His regime also systematically targeted political opponents, intellectuals, and ethnic groups suspected of disloyalty. Many were imprisoned, tortured, or forced into exile. They imposed strict control over all forms of media and communication, stifling any opposition voices. Perhaps one of the most infamous aspects of Mengistu's rule was a devastating famine that occurred in the mid-1980s. His policies, including forced collectivization and the villagization program, disrupted agricultural practices and exacerbated food shortages. The government's indifference to the suffering of its people resulted in widespread famine and the deaths of hundreds of thousands. Mengistu's regime was also responsible to Ethiopia's involvement in costly and protracted conflicts, including the Eritrean War of Independence and the Ogaden War with Somalia. These conflicts drained the country's resources and led to the loss of countless lives. Mengistu's Haile Mariam's brutal rule left Ethiopia in the state of profound suffering and devastation. His policies of terror and disregard for human rights resulted in the death of an estimated 500,000 to 2 million Ethiopians during his time in power. The economy was in shambles and the social fabric of the nation was torn apart. Mengistu's rule eventually came to an end in 1991 when rebel forces, including the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front (EPRDF), captured the capital, Addis Ababa. Mengistu fled into exile in Zimbabwe, where he has lived ever since. Despite being tried in absentia and sentenced to death in Ethiopia, he has not faced justice for his crime. Number 8. Siad Barre of Somalia. The reign of Siad Barre, who ruled Somalia from 1969 to 1991, is widely recognized as a period of tyranny, authoritarianism, and brutality. His autocratic rule and repressive policies left a lasting mark on the nation, turning Somalia from a promising African nation into a failed state. Siad Barre came to power in the military coup in 1969, ousting President Abdulrashid Ali Shamak. At the time, Somalia was grappling with political instability and economic challenges. Barre's rise was facilitated by discontent with the existing government, and he promised to bring stability and progress to the country. Once in power, Siad Barre embarked on a mission to consolidate his authority and establish a one-party state under the banner of his Somali Revolutionary Socialist Party, SRSP. As a result, he ruthlessly suppressed any form of political opposition. He dissolved the parliament, suspended the constitution, and outlawed all political parties except the SRSP. Critics and rivals were jailed, tortured, or killed. Siad Barre cultivated a personality cult, presenting himself as the father of the revolution. His image was plastered across the country, and he promoted himself as the sole savior of Somalia, creating a climate of fear and subservience. His regime discriminated against and persecuted certain ethnic groups, most notably the Isaac clan in the north. This led to widespread displacement and violence, contributing to lasting conflict in the region. The Siad Barre regime was notorious for its human rights abuses. Security forces under Barre's command carried out massacres and brutal torture on a large scale. The Notorious Gabale massacre in 1984 and the Isaac genocide in the late 1980s stand as grim examples of the regime's brutality. Barre's policies of forced collectivization and agricultural reform disrupted traditional livelihood and caused widespread suffering. People were subjected to forced labor and many died due to the harsh condition. Siad Barre's tyrannical rule eventually led to his downfall, and protracted civil war combined with growing international isolation forced him to flee the capital, Mogadishu, in 1991. His departure plunged Somalia into decades of chaos and conflict, which continue to this day. The legacy of Siad Barre's tyranny is one of devastation and suffering. His reign left Somalia divided along clan lines with deep-seated animosities that persist today. The collapse of state institutions and the absence of effective governance created a vacuum that allowed extremist groups to thrive, contributing to the ongoing instability in the country. Number 7. Gnassingbé Eyadéma of Togo. Gnassingbé Eyadéma's prolonged rule over Togo from 1967 until his death in 2005 earned him a reputation as one of the worst African dictators in history. His authoritarian regime was marked by a combination of brutal repression, political manipulation, and a penchant for maintaining an iron grip on power. His rise to power began in 1967 when he led a military coup against President Sylvanus Olympio, who had been Togo's first post-independence leader. Eyadéma's coup marked the end of Togo's brief experiment with democracy and the onset of his long oppressive rule. Once in power, Eyadéma pursued a series of strategies to consolidate his authority and maintain his grip on the country. He was quick to silence opposition voices. He banned political parties and imposed strict censorship on the media, stifling any potential challenges to his rule. Political opponents were arrested, tortured, or killed. Eyadéma cultivated a personality cult around himself, presenting himself as the indispensable leader of Togo. His image was omnipresent and he was portrayed as the father of the nation, creating a climate of fear and subservience. While Eyadéma allowed multi-party elections in the 1990s, these were marred by widespread fraud and manipulation to ensure his victory. The electoral process was largely a charade, with opposition parties severely handicapped. One of the defining characteristics of Eyadéma's rule was the egregious human rights abuses committed by his regime. Security forces under Eyadéma's command were responsible for the torture, disappearance, and extrajudicial killing of political opponents and activists. The regime's use of violence as a tool of repression was well documented. The regime also targeted specific ethnic groups and political opponents. Eyadéma from the Kabye ethnic group favored his own ethnic community, leading to ethnic tension and discrimination against other groups. Gnassingbé Eyadéma's death in 2005 did not immediately bring about significant change in Togo. His son, Faure Gnassingbé, succeeded him, further cementing the family's grip on power. While there have been some limited democratic reforms, Togo continues to face political instability, economic challenges, and human rights abuses. Number 6. Omar al-Bashir of Sudan. Omar Hassan Ahmed al-Bashir, who ruled Sudan for nearly 3 decades, is widely regarded as one of the worst African leaders in modern history. His reign was characterized by a brutal dictatorship, widespread human rights abuses, economic mismanagement, and a disastrous civil war. One of the most glaring aspects of Omar al-Bashir's leadership was his autocratic rule. He came to power in a military coup in 1989 and quickly dissolved Sudan's elected government through his rule. He maintained a tight grip on power, suppressing political opposition and silencing dissenting voices. Political parties, civil society organizations, and independent media were systematically undermined and, in many cases, banned. This authoritarian approach to governance stifled any hope of democratic progress in Sudan. Al-Bashir's regime was notorious for its appalling human rights record. The Sudanese people endured widespread torture, extrajudicial killings, and arbitrary detention. The government unleashed its brutal security apparatus, including the infamous National Intelligence and Security Service (NISS), to crush any opposition. Perhaps the most heinous crime under al-Bashir's leadership was a genocide in Darfur, where government-backed militias, known as the Janjaweed, carried out mass killings, rapes, and forced displacement, resulting in hundreds of thousands of deaths. Al-Bashir's regime was marked by religious and ethnic discrimination, with a distinct bias towards Arabization and Islamization. The government's policies marginalized non-Arab and non-Muslim communities, leading to exacerbation of ethnic and religious tensions. The conflict in South Sudan, which ultimately led to the secession of the South and the creation of a new nation in 2011, was partly rooted in the discriminatory policies. The Sudanese economy suffered immensely under al-Bashir's leadership. His government pursued reckless economic policies, including heavy borrowing and mismanagement of resources. Corruption was rampant, and the benefits of the nation's wealth were siphoned off by the ruling elite, leaving the majority of Sudanese in poverty. High inflation, unemployment, and a lack of basic services further exacerbated the economic hardship faced by the population. Al-Bashir's rule was marked by prolonged civil conflict that ravaged Sudan for years. Apart from the Darfur conflict and the secession of South Sudan, Sudan endured protracted conflict in areas like the Nubar Mountains and Blue Nile. These conflicts were fueled by the government marginalization of ethnic and religious minorities, leading to the displacement of countless civilians and humanitarian catastrophe. Omar al-Bashir's leadership also led to Sudan's international isolation. His government's support for terrorism and involvement in conflict across the region garnered widespread condemnation. Most notably, al-Bashir was indicted by the International Criminal Court (ICC) for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide committed in Darfur. This indictment further isolated Sudan on the global stage and tarnished its reputation. Number 5. Hissène Habré of Chad. Hissène Habré, who ruled Chad from 1982 to 1990, is unequivocally regarded as one of the worst African leaders in history. His 8-year reign was characterized by a brutal dictatorship, widespread human rights abuses, and a reign of terror that left a profound mark on Chad's history. Habré's rise to power in 1982 came through a military coup, which was followed by a brutal consolidation of authority. Under his leadership, Chad experienced a level of authoritarianism rarely seen in modern African history. Habré's rule was an iron fist, squashing any form of political dissent or opposition. Political parties were banned and the media was tightly controlled, leaving little room for freedom of expression. One of the defining aspects of Habré's rule was the systematic abuse of human rights. His regime was responsible for a litany of grave crimes, including torture, extrajudicial killings, and arbitrary detention. The Directorate of Documentation and Security (DDS), Habré's secret police, was notorious for its brutality and infamous detention centers, such as the Notorious prison, where torture and atrocities were routine. Thousands of Chadians were subjected to unspeakable suffering, and many never emerged from these dungeons alive. Habré's regime also fanned the flames of ethnic divisions with Chad. He pursued the policy of ethnic targeting, particularly against the Zaghawa and Hadjira ethnic groups, perceived as his political rivals. This approach fueled violent conflict, leading to mass killing. The atrocities committed during his rule, including the infamous Black September, campaign in 1984 resulted in the death of thousands of innocent civilians. Habré's economic policies were characterized by mismanagement and corruption. The country's resources were squandered and the majority of Chadians lived in abject poverty. Despite the nation's potential wealth, the regime's financial mismanagement contributed to the dire economic situation, exacerbating the sufferings of the population. His rule led to Chad's international isolation. His aggressive foreign policies, including a costly and futile war with Libya, drew the ire of neighboring countries and the international community. The ongoing conflict with Libya, which began in the late 1970s, brought destruction to Chad and further isolated the nation on the global stage. Perhaps one of the most tragic aspects of Hissène Habré's rule was the legacy of impunity. For decades, he managed to evade justice, living in exile in Senegal until his arrest in 2013. It was only in 2016 that he was convicted by the Extraordinary African Chambers in Senegal for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and torture. His trial and conviction marked a significant moment in the fight against impunity for African leaders who commit atrocities. Number 4. Muammar Gaddafi of Libya. Muammar Gaddafi, the self-proclaimed brother leader who ruled Libya for over 4 decades, is widely regarded as one of the worst African dictators in modern history. His reign, characterized by autocracy, human rights abuses, and economic mismanagement, left a lasting legacy of suffering for the Libyan people. One of the defining characteristics of Gaddafi's rule was the brutal suppression of dissent. From the moment he came to power in a military coup in 1969, Gaddafi established an authoritarian regime that stifled political opposition and silenced any form of dissent. Political parties were banned and all political power was centralized in his hands. The Green Book, Gaddafi's ideological manifesto, was promoted as the only acceptable political doctrine, leaving no room for pluralism and democratic discourse. Gaddafi's regime was notorious for its egregious human rights abuses. The Libyan people endured a climate of fear and intimidation, with arbitrary arrest, torture, and extrajudicial killings being commonplace. Gaddafi's security forces, such as the Revolutionary Committees and the Fiat Intelligence Agency, the Libyan External Security Organization, ESO, were responsible for systematic repression and violence against perceived enemies of the state. Under Gaddafi's rule, Libya became a sponsor of international terrorism. The most infamous example of this was the 1988 bombing of Pan AM Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland, which killed 270 people. Libya was found responsible for the attack, leading to international sanctions and isolation. Gaddafi's support for various militant groups in Africa and the Middle East contributed to regional instability and conflict. Gaddafi's economic policies were characterized by mismanagement and corruption. Despite Libya's vast oil wealth, much of the nation's resources were squandered and funneled into the hands of Gaddafi and his cronies. Economic diversification was neglected and the economy remained heavily dependent on oil revenue, leaving the economy vulnerable to fluctuations in global oil prices. The majority of Libyans did not benefit from the nation's wealth, leading to widespread poverty and unemployment. Gaddafi's belligerent foreign policies and support for militant groups led to conflicts that had dire consequences for Libya and its neighbors. His involvement in regional conflicts such as the Chadian-Libyan War destabilized neighboring countries and fueled animosity in the region. Gaddafi's reckless approach to foreign policy and his pursuit of nuclear weapons also drew international condemnation and sanctions. Gaddafi's regime extended its control over all aspects of Libyan society. Civic organizations, trade unions, and religious institutions were co-opted and manipulated to serve the regime's interest. The government propaganda machinery was used to create a cult of personality around Gaddafi, fostering a climate of fear and adulation. Number 3. Sani Abacha of Nigeria. Sani Abacha, who ruled Nigeria with an iron fist from 1993 until his sudden death in 1998, is widely considered one of the most brutal dictators in African history. His regime was marked by authoritarianism, gross human rights abuses, political repression, and economic mismanagement, leaving a legacy of suffering and instability in Nigeria. Abacha's regime was characterized by ruthless suppression of political opposition. He disbanded political parties, censored the media, and persecuted activists, effectively erasing any semblance of democratic governance in Nigeria. His military regime was notorious for its widespread human rights abuses. Dissidents, journalists, and activists who dared to criticize the government were subjected to arbitrary arrest, torture, and extrajudicial killings. The National Security Organization (NSO) under Abacha's control became an instrument of state-sponsored terror, instilling fear among the population. Under Abacha's rule, corruption reached unprecedented levels in Nigeria. Billions of dollars were embezzled and looted from the nation's coffers, with the dictator and his cronies benefiting disproportionately. Economic mismanagement further exacerbated Nigeria's woe, leading to high inflation, unemployment, and the lack of essential services for the people. Abacha's regime targeted civil society organizations and human rights defenders, undermining their ability to advocate for the rights of Nigerian citizens. Prominent activists such as Ken Saro-Wiwa, who championed environmental and social justice in the Niger Delta, were arrested and executed, sending a chilling message to anyone who dared to challenge the government. Sani Abacha's brutal rule led to Nigeria's international isolation. The international community, including Western countries, condemned his regime for its gross human rights abuses, electoral fraud, and support for state-sponsored terror. Nigeria faced sanctions and diplomatic isolation during this period. Abacha's regime was marked by political assassination, including the mysterious death of key political figures. The most notable of these was the death of Moshood Abiola, the presumed winner of the annulled 1993 election, who died in custody in 1998. These assassinations and manipulation further eroded any trust in the government and sowed discord among Nigerian political elite. Number 2. Charles Taylor of Liberia. Charles Taylor, the former president of Liberia, is widely regarded as one of the worst human rights violators in history. His reign from 1997 to 2003 was characterized by extreme brutality, widespread atrocities, and a complete disregard for human rights. One of the most significant reasons behind Charles Taylor's reputation as a human rights violator is his role in prolonging Liberia's devastating civil war. Taylor initially entered the conflict in 1989 as a rebel leader, leading a faction known as the National Patriotic Front of Liberia (NPFL). His insurgency contributed to the destabilization of the country, leading to over a decade of conflict and countless civilian casualties. Another disturbing aspect of Taylor's rule was the widespread use of child soldiers. Taylor's forces and rebel groups under his influence forcibly recruited children, some as young as 7 years old, to fight in the conflict. These children were subjected to unimaginable horrors, including violence, drug addiction, and sexual abuse, leaving lasting scars on an entire generation. Taylor's leadership was characterized by exploiting ethnic and religious division for political gain. He fueled animosity between Liberia's various ethnic groups and religious communities, exacerbating tension and causing further violence. The Liberian conflict became a complex web of inter-ethnic rivalries and grievances. Sexual violence was rampant during Taylor's rule, with reports of rape, sexual slavery, and other forms of gender-based violence being widespread. Women and girls were particularly vulnerable, and many became victims of brutal attacks by armed groups. Taylor's regime was notorious for the exploitation of Liberia's vast natural resources, particularly diamonds and timber. He used these resources to fund his war effort and maintain his grip on power. The illicit trade in blood diamonds helped fuel conflict in neighboring countries and contributed to regional instability. Taylor's involvement in regional conflict extended beyond Liberia's borders. He supported rebel movement in neighboring Sierra Leone, providing arms, training, and logistics support to groups responsible for horrific atrocities, including the amputation of civilians' limbs and mass killings. His actions eventually led to his indictment by the United Nations-backed Special Court for Sierra Leone, SCSL, for war crimes and crimes against humanity. In 2012, he was found guilty of aiding and abetting war crimes, marking a landmark moment in international justice. Number 1. Idi Amin Dada of Uganda. Idi Amin Dada, who ruled Uganda from 1971 to 1979, is widely considered one of the most brutal African dictators ever to hold power. His 8-year reign was marked by extreme cruelty, widespread human rights abuses, and a reign of terror that left an indelible scar on Uganda's history. One of the defining characteristics of Idi Amin's rule was the systematic repression of dissent and arbitrary violence against perceived enemies of the state. Amin's regime was responsible for the torture, imprisonment, and extrajudicial killings of thousands of Ugandans, including intellectuals, political opponents, and ethnic and religious minorities. His government security forces, such as the State Research Bureau and the General Service Unit, were notorious for their brutality and operated with impunity. Amin exploited ethnic and religious divisions in Uganda to maintain his grip to power. He belonged to the minority Kakwa ethnic group and capitalized on ethnic favoritism, targeting other ethnic groups, notably the Ocholi and Langi, for persecution. Additionally, Amin's policies fueled religious tensions, leading to expulsion of the Asian Ugandan community in 1972, which further destabilized the economy. Perhaps the most horrific aspect of Amin's rule was the state-sponsored terror and mass killings that took place during his reign. The most infamous incident was the Entebbe hijacking in 1976, where Amin provided support to Palestinian terrorists who hijacked an Israeli plane and held hostages at the Entebbe airport. This act of terrorism resulted in the death of innocent civilians and underscored Amin's willingness to align with international terrorists. Amin's rule was marked by unpredictable and erratic behavior. He conducted violent purges within his own government and military, often executing high-ranking officials without warning. The climate of fear and insecurity extended to all levels of society, as anyone could become a target of the dictator's wrath. Amin's economic policies were disastrous for Uganda. He expelled the Asian Uganda community, who were key contributors to the economy, leading to a collapse in various industries. Economic mismanagement, corruption, and nepotism further exacerbated the country's economic decline, leaving the majority of Ugandans in dire poverty. It is not surprising that his rule led to Uganda's international isolation. His support for international terrorism, involvement in regional conflicts, and erratic behavior earned him the condemnation of the international community. The expulsion of the Asian Uganda community and the accompanying economic coerce further isolated Uganda from the global stage. There you have it. the 10 most notorious African military juntas. Let us know in the comments which of these leaders do you think caused the most havoc to the motherland. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to this channel. You can check out the channel for other relevant videos. Watch out for other upcoming hot videos on this channel. We will see you next time.